We're back in your home in sunny France while it's snowing here in Finland, and we wanted today to talk about the path of equity. The path of equity being one of 15 life paths that we've been talking about over the last few weeks. We're doing this streaming. For those of you who don't know, we're streaming regularly around archetypes. And Jonas is my brother and a therapist, and we're like complementary because he's wearing the white, I'm wearing the black. Normally, he's looking at the dark side of humans, I'm looking at the light side, but maybe today we switch roles. And we've got today a very abstract one actually, because path of equity. If we look at the archetypes, the idea is to help people go on an inner journey and designing their own future, whether it's a change of job, change of career, change of life, change of personal growth direction. And we're using this archetype wheel, which is a coloring tool that I've been using for years for coaching, where each of these little people, personas in there is an archetype out of 45. There's organized in different paths, and each path has three. And each session we do one of the paths with three archetypes, giving examples and illustration, so that those of you who want to color in with that archetype can do so with a bit of understanding of what we mean by it, and just to have the tangible downloadable version of it. This is what we mean. So if you want to have a look at this, click that QR code. You can download a high res version of it. I'll be working through this with Jonas today. Jonas, today, path of equity is more on your table. You've had probably a few more experiences and colored more on your mandala around the path of equity, which has three roles: the victim, the rebel, and then the last one, the judge. So if we start with the victim, it's not an archetype that many people would go like, oh yeah, I want to be a victim. I want to be today. I want to experience tomorrow being a victim. So it's clearly something that many people would feel that they've perhaps been, but don't necessarily want to replicate. But maybe you could share an example or two about what we mean. And if I zoom in a little bit more here, the victim focused on order. Do you have an example, Jonas?
So you could think of this one as anytime something has happened to you that made you feel bad or made you feel victimized in some way. So obviously we're all victims of something, right? You could look at this in the meta level. We're all victims of our sociological condition and environment. For example, if you're born in a lower class family, lower income bracket, well, you're a victim of your social condition. It could be victim of your genetic condition if you have a disease, a chronic disease that you didn't choose and that's happening to you. It could be victim of someone else's imperfection. Say you've been in a car accident, someone just ran into you. So it's not about being a victim. It's not that being a victim is a bad thing, because it's inevitable to have stuff happen to us. But then the challenge at this level is often, okay, well, how do I deal when I've been in a car crash, I have a chronic condition, I'm suffering an injustice in one way or another? How do I respond to that? And that starts to raise the question of responsibility. Who is responsible for this? Okay, so I've been in a car crash. Well, it's their fault. They shouldn't have been driving that fast. They ran into me. So that purely on them. We'll have insurance, sort it out, and I'll take them to court and we'll correct this wrong, but it's on them, and it's up to the institutions to protect me. Or in the case of an injustice, say you tragically lose your pet. You know, you had a pet that you adored, and it just happens to run away. It's gone, never to be seen again. Uh, who do you blame then? Like, do you then blame the pet? Do you blame higher powers to have taken it away from you? Do you blame yourself for having let it escape? And basically, a lot of this is blocked or unblocked depending on how you manage to position yourself with regards to the question of responsibility. Maybe now, Esther, would be a good time to bring up the drama triangle as a
Oh
little
yeah.
way to illustrate the one lens to look at it.
If I open that
Um,
up a little bit bigger so that you can see the whole picture, and I'll put myself there so you can see it. I'll hide.
yeah,
Do you want to talk through it, Jonas? Since we've talked about this in the context of conflicts and therapy many times.
yeah. So this is basically the age-old recipe for drama, be it Greek tragedy or geopolitical tragedy. So just generally, the recipe for drama requires a victim, an aggressor, and a savior. And typically the game starts with a victim feeling victimized and blaming an aggressor. So I was in a car accident. The person in the German sports car ran into me. They're the aggressor. And then, generally, for real drama to happen, you need a savior to step in from the sideline who just sees this and decides to take a side and protect one of the parties. And from there, if things are going wrong, you have an escalation with more and more of this dynamic going on. And typically, the victim would switch to being the aggressor, for example, and you could justify throwing a punch at the driver of the sports car because he ran into you. You were on your way to work. You could have had your kids in the car. Come on, like a bit of instant karma, right? It's justified. It's right. It feels right because he's wronged me, so I can hurt him back to the extent that he hurt me. So then the victim would become the aggressor, or potentially the victim could blame the savior for not saving in the right way or not actually helping, and then become the aggressor of the savior, and then more and more people get roped in. So obviously, I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but it's a very interesting lens to look at conflict through, and it's relevant to this specific pathway because depending on how you're taking responsibility, let's go back to the same example. You've been in an accident. If you're taking part of the responsibility, you then take some of the control. So, okay, well, I was also driving in a way that wasn't perfectly safe, so I contributed at least in part to this. So I'm not going to beat the other guy up. Or some of this is no one's fault. Like, it's generally an acceptable probability when you're driving that you might at some point end up in an accident. By definition, it's an accident. You don't control everything. And in that example, let's imagine you're okay physically. Well, then you don't step into that drama triangle too much because you've managed to look at things in a bit more of a nuanced way and you're able to have a proportionate response to whose level of responsibility is what. So you would then just take the registration of the person that ran into you and you would solve it normally through insurance. And yeah, you would deal with your own responsibility by maybe being extra careful next time you're driving, and avoid certain situations to mitigate that risk. But yeah, just a little lens to look at this question through, and generally to start moving towards the next level when you're starting to exercise control related to the things that happen to you. Very often what happens first is you get angry. You feel victimized by something, and then you rebel against that injustice in one way or another. So I don't know, in what way do you feel you've been a rebel, Estève, in
Or
your
victim
life?
actually first, because
Or a
I think for
victim, yeah.
me, if I look at it from the lens of communication, I think
Mm,
because the end of this path is about creating law and order, but it doesn't have to be in the sort of legal sense. It can also be in the communication sense. So for me, being a victim has been, of course, there's many places where I could see myself as a victim of something, but for this example, I would use communication, being in conversations where I was literally not able to communicate because there was no order, there was no rules, the conversation was completely chaotic, there was a lack of order. And in that role of the if I zoom into the actual first one, there's the key word underneath is order, and order is the key focus of that archetype. So if you're coloring these in as a viewer to this video, basically if you color in, it's because at some point you felt the lack of order. You felt being a victim is a lack of order in some way or another. So for me, that's been in communication many times, like being in work. I remember one being in a university alumni Zoom where lots of friends from university, and I hadn't seen some for about 8 years, some even longer, and there was literally no hosting. It was just a chaotic who's the loudest will talk, and it was terrible. Like I didn't even feel like connecting with anybody else because there was so much chaos in the conversation, and if you had to shout to be able to actually get your point. And the whole conversation, from a beautiful intention of connecting everybody from the alumni of the university, I literally walked out of that conversation before the end because I was so frustrated, the lack of order, that there wasn't even a hosted like check-in. Or so it was like those who could type would type, those who would talk over each other, and then you ended. So to me, I felt like a bit of a. It's not like a victim in the sense of, traditionally a victim, but I felt a victim of that situation there, and I could have easily moved towards being a rebel by going like, right, it should be fair that everybody gets to speak, and I'm going to be a rebel and I'm going to take over the conversation because I know how to. I didn't, but that's an example for me of the victim role. What about you?
I think one of the ways in which I really tasted that first level would have been actually in school. I felt like a victim of a system. That was my first taste, I think, of real injustice. Was the rigid public French school system, and being told and taught certain things that were literally absurd, knowing that they're absurd, and having to take it because I said so, and also having some fundamental principles like if you're having fun, you're not learning seriously, and proper education is necessarily boring and unpleasant, and that contrasting sharply with my experience and my natural like energy and curiosity. I mean, you knew me as a kid. I would have been an easy kid to teach because I was curious. I wanted to know. I asked absurd questions every 5 minutes, but I really had that drilled out of me in school. Well, at least I realized that I wasn't going to get that through school, and then very quickly I realized, okay, what I have to do for my personal motivation and development to stay sane is in many respects completely different to what I have to do or what I'm allowed to do in school. So that's when I started to find these workarounds in a way to just get good enough grades to be able to move forward and do what I wanted to do in school. But I never, in practice, like I never tried to get the highest grade. I didn't care. I just wanted to fly under the radar and just maximize the return for the minimal effort. Our father used to go insane and say that I would practice the la loi du moindre effort, the law of least effort in French. So that's like how I felt victimized, and then how I started sliding towards the rebel.
Let's talk about the rebel. Let's
Yeah.
talk about the rebel then. What would be the rebel role? How would you exemplify, like what have you done that sort of embodies the rebel archetype?
I mean, I have to think back to the boarding house days. So I was in boarding school for lycée, for high school, and so we had these rules, this curfew, all the things that we were and weren't allowed to do, obviously. And I found a way to just pick and choose which rules I would follow. But the main thing is learning not to get caught. It's not so much about obeying the rules, it's about managing to just evade capture. That's the main objective. And it's not that there were no rules, no holes barred, just complete chaos and orgies, but it was, yeah, more like actually quite boring and generic, right? We used to smoke joints in the bathrooms and put towels under the door and hide the lights and have all these advanced protocols not to set off the fire alarms and not to have the room smell. We would exit the bathroom in a tactical like SWAT file where one would open the door and the others would rush behind and the last one would close the door. So you had all these rules that were made up to break the rules. So I guess the path of the rebel raises the question of authority and legitimacy of authority, and then poses the question of how does one choose good rules and update them regularly? Because in that silly example, in practice, we had tight rules like around whether it's whoever rolled the joint is the one that smokes it first, to in what order we would leave the bathroom. There was a reason for this, but ironically, it was in total opposition and rejection of the rules that were prescribed and actually just imposed upon us. So I guess, yeah, you could say that those are some of the questions that are raised by this, and you can rebel in different ways. Obviously, you can rebel partially, you can rebel totally, you can rebel intelligently, or you can rebel like a teenager who's essentially wasting his freedom on just getting high, but still getting through school and doing things. But I mean, yeah, being a rebel isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. It depends on, I guess, how it's done. Obviously.
So the roles here, as we're framing them in this archetype path from left to right, where the victim is the first one, the yin archetype, the one focused on the internal side of things and order, and then the second one, the rebel, focused on the external and the justice and the sense of, almost like moral high ground. I need justice for something. Um, the third one, the judge.
Mm.
Like this reminds me of something that I experienced with one of my first jobs. I was literally the rebel, and I wanted to turn into the judge because I was in this workplace consulting office in Avignon in the south of France, and it was 90% women and me, and then the two bosses who were men. And so I was in my gendered view of the world where it was not fair that the bosses were men and the women were the employees. So I took justice in my own hands, and I led this internal staff revolution. Contacted the unions. I actually, I had lawyers involved because they were misbehaving, the bosses and everything, and I became this sort of justice warrior internally. And basically I was just a real troublemaker. I was like, I must have been really difficult to work with in those days. And what I was not aware of is that to take the posture of the judge, it's more than just a question of fairness and equality. The topic of equity first appeared in my mind. Like, what is equity versus equality? Like, equity is based being fair around everybody's differences, needs, whereas equality was about access to equal resources and privileges and benefits. And the whole conversation shifted when I took to the management the idea of equity and said, look, and this is where we took a different posture. Than rather than being a rebel, I started being a negotiator, looking at the judge posture, looking at peace between all the different people's view. The only way we could unlock that was talking about there are different needs. Woman X had to leave earlier because of picking up kids from school. She had a different set of needs than person Y, who didn't have kids, and the guy who, whatever, different needs. And so to me, the posture of judge, the archetype of judge, is something that you embody when you start looking beyond the typical childish and simplistic views of fairness. It's not fair, but actually going towards weigh-in, hence the icons being like these scales, weigh in carefully equity versus equality, and how do we use different ways of measuring when some people are talking about equality and others are talking about equity. It's like very confusing. So peace is the key focus as I saw it there, because without the desire for everybody to be at peace with the rules, it just is inflammatory. It just adds fire, like in French strikes, where whatever somebody says, it's an excuse to add more fire and more fuel to the fire. So the key focus, therefore, of the judge is to sort of connect everybody around the idea that here we're aiming for a peaceful resolution or use of the rules. So, what are your experience? Have you been experiencing the archetype of judge in any of your roles?
I think, yeah, if I look at it in the most tangible way possible, I think for me the experience of the judge is really when it comes to the internal court system and deliberately developing one's own moral code of conduct, or just rules that I apply to myself, essentially. Because if we relate this now a little bit to the transactional analysis model of, we have a inner parent, an inner child, and we develop an inner adult that's kind of mediating that conversation. You could essentially overlap those lenses in the way that typically the victim would be our inner child, in some way. The rebel would be the inner parent who's like, this is the rule, the way it should be, it isn't, so I'm going to take things into my own hands to make it fair. And then the judge is the inner adult that learns to mediate between these things and find somewhat of a middle ground. So in practice, I'm going to tell you about an exercise that I often give to patients of mine who are struggling with guilt in some form. Like that specific idea that there's a rule, the way things should be, and they are responsible for something that didn't go well. And in some way, they're beating themselves up, and often they end up being paralyzed by that guilt more than able to turn it into something constructive. So, to relate this to this most advanced level, what I tell them is, in an ideal case, right, you want to treat yourself like you treat others, right? And there is such a thing as good practice when it comes to giving out judgment, right? There's a time for forgiving, forgetting, and giving yourself a pass. But there's a time where you make a mistake and you can't ignore that you made a mistake, right? So I often tell them, now let's try and copy a legal system that's relatively fair, right? So let's maybe not go for the South American jail. Let's maybe lean a little bit more towards the Swedish prison model. I think so. Let's benchmark that to make it fair. So the first thing you need to do is you need to define the offense, right? And okay, you genuinely feel that you fucked up, but can you tell me in what way you broke that internal law or the actual law? Exactly how do you define the mistake that you made? Because if you can't define that mistake, you can't come up with an appropriate compensation for that mistake. So what I invite them to do generally is to take turns between these different parts. There's the police officer that's, doing the investigation and who's basically taking down facts and who's going to pass that on to the legal administration, who's then going to come up with, is this worth prosecuting or not, and who's then going to basically start the legal procedure. So once you've defined what the mistake is, that's when you need to maybe look at it a bit more closely and again go into the question of responsibilities. Okay, is this a mistake that you could not have made? Is this an error of judgment? Is this a mistake that you've done again? Is this the second time that you're here because you're drinking and driving? Or is this the first time that you accidentally just damaged someone's property because, I don't know, a tree fell from your garden and into their fence? Like, you have to treat those things differently, obviously. So once you've really investigated, could you have made that mistake, not made that mistake? How bad is it? Then you can move to the last level, the level of judgment, where essentially you're looking at things in context and you're trying to restore some degree of balance, right? In a good legal system, the idea is judgment is supposed to help compensate, repair whatever damage was done and protect society from further damage. It's there to kind of like educate you, sometimes punish you, and that's where different legal systems are very different. And still to this day, we tend to be heavily on the punishment side, not so much on the rehabilitate side, which, I mean, is questionable to say the least. But if you look at this in terms of our internal legal system, the last level, the judgment level, in the positive case, you would manage to come up with something that is proportionate to the actual crime that you've committed. Have you committed just a misdemeanor, a crime, a felony, whatever you actually done? And it should aim to, in practice, in the real world, do something that you can then feel better about yourself. Do something to just make you feel like you're able to take some responsibility, but you're not just beating yourself up. Oh, bad me, I made a mistake. But you're actually, okay, I made a mistake. This is exactly in what way I fucked up. This is what I can learn from it. And this is now what I'm going to do, or what I can do, to at least not make that mistake again or repair some of the damages that I've done. And if we manage to have that own standard that we hold ourselves to, I think it helps also to avoid slipping into the drama triangle. And yeah, it just gives us some control over what happens to us. We can't help being a victim, but we can learn to move up the ladder to come up with fair judgment, and not just authoritarian judgment based on a rigid law. And this is where you can see that there's also a parallel with mental illness to some degree. If you have too strict of an internal legal system, that can look like neurosis from the outside, like a really obsessive person who has to have it clean, who has to have it done a certain way. If it's not right, it's not right. It's dangerous. There's a problem. We need to make sure that, and if they make a mistake, they will not forgive themselves. They're not going to be like, don't worry, it's your first offense, you're fine. Plus, you were tired, you had an emotional context that made it. It's fine. Like, don't beat yourself up about it. The mental narrative of that kind of person does not allow for mistake, typically. So yeah, you can use this lens to look at quite a few different things. And the example that you gave at work of stepping into the savior, the justice warrior, um, without necessarily being given the explicit mandate, that can also lead to some problems, and it could be a potential waste of all that good energy. And it's interesting to see that in the end, it turned into something else. When it was more balanced, it turned into mediation and not taking justice into your own hands, essentially. So, questioning in terms of reflection points, how do I give a mandate to others to be involved with my justice? What mandates do other people actually give me? and what is the right level of responsibility and action to match that responsibility whenever I feel that the law, something is happening that's not fair, that's not just, in whatever sense you define it. And maybe just a final reflection point would be on how aware am I of my own internal legal system and how it operates, and how deliberately am I actually doing something about it? Do I have an imbalance there? Do I have a very good public defender but a terrible prosecutor? Do I have a very good process but a shitty judge at the end who's just always
Mhm.
dozy after lunch and handing out half-assed justice? So it's often interesting to reflect on those points, just to empower ourselves and to remind ourselves of some of the control that we do have, even though, again, we're all going to be victims of something. That's not avoidable. Yeah.
It just you made me want to jump in to go like, okay, let's play therapist. You're going to be the therapist, I'm going to be the patient, and I'm going to bring my cases. It'd be quite interesting to do this on stream as well. It's just like to submit some things, and how would you isolate the elements, dissect it, help me move forward like this with this case. If I brought the case to the table, that victim, rebel, judge in those three archetypes, me, I would be a victim as, let's say, to take a topic that's really, really explosive at the moment that I've been exploring with Gita online, is like the gendering. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the talk of being gendered, being like pushed into a gender bucket without wanting to, and being a victim of gendering. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if I've been gendered and then I start becoming genderer as a rebel and I become the aggressor, change the triangle position, and then how do I step into the judge role? What's the sort of shortcut to go into the judge role if I've been gendered as a victim and then I become gendering as a rebel? How would I? What would be the first thing to do there?
Or it would be to define who's judging what. Are we talking about how this gendering has affected your judgment of yourself? And in that case, how does that affect your self-image? And what about that feels unfair and why? And in what way does that hurt? And why is that potentially something that's unacceptable?
Mm,
Um, if we're judging society and how things should be,
yeah.
then one would argue, okay, well, what is a appropriate response to not just have to accept, oh, I'm going to be misgendered, but without going and becoming super militant about it and counterproductive to the cause by bringing discredit to the topic of gender, by not being proportionate in responses and not allowing factual conversation and debate and not properly defining things and actually having a reflection on the thing.
Mm,
Are you just expecting people to just have to agree or disagree with you, and if they disagree they're wrong? That type of judgment, if again we're thinking about how society should be, um, that's a very tricky conversation, and it's the conversation about how is one appropriately political in our lives.
mm,
We could think about this topic when we think about the massacres that are happening in the Middle East right now. Not making any distinction between who is killing who. There's just thousands of people dying pointlessly, mostly for economic reasons, I would argue. But how does one take a political stand that's useful? Is it useful to go out and post things for people to agree or disagree with, and just to end up just sharing information with people who agree with you? Is it more useful not to talk about that topic and just to live your life and to treat people from whatever side with the decency that you would treat anyone with? What is more political? So the question of judgment really depends on who is judging who and why are
mm.
we actually casting that judgment. Or it could be the question of how are you judging the people directly, your aggressors that have misgendered you. In practice, how do you handle that when that happens? Do you jump to their throats or not? Yeah.
I was just jumping in here because what's really interesting about our conversations is that you're looking at it from the assumption as a therapist that everybody understands that there is an inner narrative that is different to reality.
Yeah.
But I think when the topic of judge comes on the table, because on this line here that we're looking on the order 15, this is the one that has the word judge, which brings the topic of judgment. And in our internal narrative, judgment is generally not distinguished between judging oneself and judging others. People tend to notice the judgment of others But the judging of self is where usually you sort of unpack that in journaling, self-reflection, or if you're lucky enough to have a therapist like Jonas that kind of say like, okay, hey, right now what's going on in your narrative is not necessarily reality. It's just your narrative, and let's look at that objectively. Because what I've noticed is that in a narrative, we spend a lot of time talking to ourselves, and because we think it's true. And as a therapist, you obviously know this. That's the ground zero for doing any form of therapy work, is to acknowledge that the inner narrative is not necessarily reality, that it can be very disconnected. So in the topic of being the judge, in the archetype of being a judge, it's really easy for us to forget that that's also an archetype that we take within ourselves, towards ourselves, as well as a position that we might take in an archetypal, judge in a court of law, or judge in a business sense. We're taking judgments of, for example, HR. Judging a behavior that is not DEI compliant is taking the archetype position of the judge as well. So it's a really tricky topic, as you said, because it opens political correctness. It opens what are the values at work, in the workplace, that you're judging against. What are the laws, the bylaws? So
Yeah.
one of the topics that we could sort of bring to the table here is that each of the paths has a sacred practice, or something that you do to get more down that path, further down the path. And at the end of the path on this side is the observance of rules. And when I started drawing this, I didn't have as much intel on the topic of rules than I do now. And maybe we could talk a little bit, Jonas, about in general sense, why are rules even important scientifically? What is
That's a
the
good.
purpose of the
Yeah.
rule?
Yeah. We need to, because we can define rules in a few different ways, right? There's the rule of nature, for example. In that case, we mean principles. There are certain ways, processes that seem to happen, that seem to obey certain laws of physics, laws of chemistry, and all those different things. Then you have rules at the level of society, structures, agreed processes, again, and those typically happen relatively organically as well. We naturally assemble into small groups. The family unit, even though it varies culturally, there always seems to be some degree of distinction between the inner circle, the outer circle. So we can't help but have rules, and they can be implicit or explicit. There are rules when it comes to, again, rules defined as principles. Uh, there are principles to health, for example. We know if every morning you get up and you just have heroin and coffee, and then processed foods for the rest of the day with zero exercise and no intellectual stimulation whatsoever, chances are you're not going to be very happy, and you're not going to be very healthy. It's a principle. So we need them in order to exercise control, first of all, to figure out in this whole, because let's face it, reality, as you said, in many respects is different from what we think it is and understand it for. So a lot of this is a bit random, chaotic, absurd, violent, and we don't have that much power and control if we're being very cynical and pragmatic about it. So why are we even trying to exercise control, and where do we decide where we exercise control? So we need
Mm.
certain rules just for ourselves to know, rules of thumb. How do I manage this chaos in a way that I can potentially survive, maybe even be happy to some extent, and even maybe reach some goals that I've set out for myself. So we need rules in order to manage that chaos and be able to exercise some degree of control, and to guarantee some degree of safety as well. Like, why do we need rules at the level of society? It helps to minimize the extent to which we murder and rape each other, um,
And
to
I'll
some
I'll
degree.
I'll I'll bring in the field, which is my field of communication, into that as well. Because if you think of communication rules, the absence of any communication rules is generally not an absence of rules. It's an absence of explicit rules. But people always operate with implicit rule. Example, in a conversation in Finland, it's implicit that you don't interrupt. It's not, you don't start a meeting by saying, I'm not going to interrupt you. You just implicitly know that the rule is not to interrupt if you're culturally aware of Finnish culture. Now, explicit rule could be like, okay, if we're going to interrupt each other, let's do it with this hand signal. Okay. And we do it because we mean enthusiasm and not disrespect. Okay, so suddenly you give meaning to a rule that is explicit. So just to clarify the difference between implicit and explicit, spoken, unspoken. And what I've noticed is that in science, when we start talking about chaotic balance of chaos and order, the whole idea of bringing chaotic balance into a, for example, conversational workshop or online meeting is not just for the sake of creating control, but it's actually to reach flow for everybody, that everybody has kind of right implicitly to reach a state of flowing communication and not be utterly bored, which happens too often online. And that happens when actually counterintuitively for many, there are more rules, because when you to get chaotic balance, you need clear roles, clear rules, and clear process. Everything else can be chaotic and emergent. But if you don't have clear roles, clear rules, and clear process, then generally what happens is that it becomes, some people are victim of the conversation and they disconnect, they go on their phones, multitask, they're not present anymore. So the rule can be actually an empowering and balancing thing. From a social science point of view, when you're in a meeting, having rules actually unlocks creativity, opens freedom to speak for some who are more shy and introvert, and allows for a more efficient flowing process in an online conversation, for example, which for many people is completely counterintuitive when they resist all form of rules. I don't want rules. Let's make this really organic and fluid, when in fact it creates more chaos than anything else. So that was just an example of how, as a judge, like you and I have both been a judge in that communication sense in a mediation context. If we go to conflict mediation, conflict facilitation, conflict transformation, those three, when we're conflict mediating, we're taking a judge role in the archetype sense of collectively going, okay, my intention is to bring peace. My intention is to pacify and transform these tensions into creative energy and problem solving, and in a peaceful way. Therefore, I will bring the first rule, which is the rule of hand, like, for example, talking peace, this kind of thing. So just a note that observation of rules is not necessarily a constriction. It can actually be an empowering and an unleashing of creative problem solving.
And for that, it generally requires those rules to make sense to the people, and they have to understand and choose why they're actually applying them. Because to just come up with the perfect set of rules and beat them into people doesn't work. We know, we've tried it enough in history. It doesn't work, and that's the challenge with our legal system, is updating law at the same time as society is evolving, so that it stays relevant to people, and the people adhere to all of it and the whole of it, and that it feels fair to them.
Yeah.
Why do more people commit tax fraud than murder? Because for most people, they don't need the law to tell them that they shouldn't kill people.
Yeah.
They naturally don't really want to, but they
Yeah.
feel screwed over by the taxation system, so they're more likely to try and cheat that to some degree, because that's how they're going to compensate that injustice. So again, there are principles about setting principles. There are good practices for coming up with law and rules, and you need to regularly update them, and they have to be, I would argue, emergent from the people for them to really be able to be sustained over time, and not end up with just too many rebels and a system that doesn't work, essentially.
Or one thing I've experienced in the hat of the rebel is being a slight bit rebellious in a meeting that isn't framed, which doesn't have hosting, doesn't have facilitation, is utter chaos, waste of time for everybody. Being a rebel, I've done this a few times, where you take the rebel hat and you say, out of collective intelligence, so that we can unite around this common problem efficiently, I'm going to bring these two rules. How do you feel about it? Yes, no? And then framing those implicit things that people need as an explicit rule. Sometimes it can be quite a rebellious thing to do. And a rebel doesn't have to be a troublemaker. A rebel can just be somebody who's daring to stick their head out for the collective benefit, in a sense. So rebel can also be a very positive. All of them are neutral in a sense, like you said earlier, Jonas.
Yeah.
Are there any, in terms of therapy, is there anything to add on this? Because like, it's a big topic, judging, victim, rebellion. I mean, probably a large part of your therapy practice is around people who've been either victim or feel that they've been victimized by something. So this is literally the core of some of your work. what would be like a good homework takeaway reflection question around the path of equity, around victim, rebel, judge, and rules, and all these things we've been talking about, Jonas, that you would recommend?
So, to help people gain more clarity about their own internal legal system in a way, it could be interesting to question guilt in order to get to the rules that seem to be implicit. So, in terms of a reflection goal, could be interesting to try and make explicit as many of those implicit rules and processes that you have, that you carry inside of you. You could look at it on the outside. What typically angers you the most? What do you judge the most from the outside? So, judge defined simply as you're labeling it as good or bad, and then questioning why is this good or why is this bad. So it's
Mm.
often interesting to question and to reflect on what we judge in other people, and it very often points back to something about us as well. So yeah, questioning guilt, questioning judgment, that's always interesting. And yeah, just trying to take a concrete example next time that you feel someone has wronged you, and map out your autopilot on that front. Like, map out the first step. Don't do anything differently. Just become aware of how you naturally deal when someone has been less than optimal to you. How do you give responsibility, take responsibility? How do you channel that negativity or the rebelliousness, the anger that you have? Like, how does that come out, literally, or does it come out? And then another time when a similar situation comes up, just try to come up with a deliberate plan. Then try and come up with behaviors, concrete things that you could do, say, or do differently, and see how that changes how you feel about. So let's take something small, like next time your husband or wife doesn't, or partner leaves their socks on the floor, right? Do you just like moan, complain, pick them up, put them in the laundry basket, and then sulk and make sure, because they should know, you shouldn't have to tell them? Or do you wait for them to come home, tell them, look, I've told you, maybe you don't realize that this is actually something that is important to me because of that. I understand you're probably not doing it on purpose, but look, can you please just pick them up, put them in? It would really make me feel appreciated and loved. Um, Maybe they wouldn't respond in quite the same way. Um, Maybe it won't be enough to guarantee that they'll always put their socks in the dirty washing basket, but
Mm.
in any case, you can use this concrete framework, these archetypes, to question how you're dealing with judging, casting out judgment, handing out punishments, because that's another thing that we haven't really talked about that comes up a lot in therapy, and that comes up in the non-violent communication framework as well. Is typically in the less healthy options, we punish other people, ourselves, and directly, without telling them what mistake they've made, and not necessarily in proportion to what they've actually done. So we punish people if they say no to us. Oh, can we go on a date tonight, please? And they say no to you, and then you're like, okay, well then you withdraw, and you put them in horny jail for a week. You know, that you punish people in all sorts of potentially insidious ways without realizing. But yeah, reflecting on the ways in which you feel punished by other people, and how you actually dish out punishment, and if punishing them is actually really what is going to get you your desired result. Yeah, there's a lot that you could reflect on this, and a lot of philosophy that you can go into as well on guilt, shame, punishment. Those are big topics for a reason as well, and there's really quite a lot of material that you can feed off on that front.
I'm going to zoom out, Jonas. So in these videos, we're doing always like the three archetypes, the end of the path, which is in this case the observance of rules, looking at how to set rules, whether it's in meetings, whether it's in home or workplace, or in a traditional sense, legal rules. Um, Finally, like as a zoom out from this inner quest, the whole idea of this was to actually be able to color in the different archetypes that people would choose, and embody in the future. Because when we think of our future, we often are constrained and have limiting beliefs that are revolving around what we already know and are familiar with. So this is about opening up the horizon, standing on the top of the mountain here and looking at different horizons. So what's the like I'm trying to sort of finish with a positive note of what would be on the path of equity, which is a word that most people don't understand and confuse with equality. with the observance of rules, which many, again, people see as like, oh, it's just a hindrance, I have to have rules. What would be the sort of the treasure, if you think of it in a sort of hero's journey? What would be the treasure of going on that path, spending a career or part of your life exploring the victim, rebel, judge, observance of rules path?
I think the treasure would be able to have just enough order in the chaos and just enough rules to protect essentially the good side of experience, to feel the love, the connection, to channel the collective intelligence, and to get the best out of ourselves and each other. I think that's the goal. If you manage to set rules with compassion from a place of love, it sounds like super corny what I'm saying, but I think it's the simplest way to say it. Yeah, setting rules from a place of love to protect things that are worth loving and that make us feel connected and that bring out the beautiful sides of our our species as well, because we are often quick to judge ourselves negatively collectively as well, but humans are capable of incredible good. It's just not being broadcast quite as much, but there's definitely an abundance of examples of ways in which life is beautiful, people can fundamentally be great, and how life can taste and feel very good, not all the time but at least sometimes, and some degree of order guarantees that, at least to some degree. So I would say that's the gold. That's why you should buy this journey today, and why you should embark on the journey of equity starting now. And early coupon discount -60%. No, I'm joking. But yeah.
And download the archetype wheel here. Actually, also another angle is that if you think of the path of equity as something very close to family life, it's essentially in a family dynamic, somebody needs to be the framing. In French, repère is a play on word with having markers to know where is right and wrong. And père is father. So I'm not saying that it's the job of the father. It could be the job of any guardian to set rules, but it does create more harmonious family dynamics when there are clear boundaries of where things can be okay and not okay. So in the family context, it helps to create peace and harmony within the family dynamics. And the other, I think, that's another takeaway from this, from my side, is going down that path helps to understand how to have flow at work, how to be enjoying and have positive psychology at work, where it's not just about challenge and strife, but it's actually about enjoying and being self-motivated around getting things done in a way that are enjoyable and flowing. And that comes from having the right minimal set of rules that create this chaotic balance that we talked about earlier. So thank you, Jonas, for today. We'll do the next streaming next week, like usual, on Monday, and we'll be going through another path and gradually compiling all of these so that anybody who wants to coloring this mandala and do some self-reflection with some really new directions in their life, then can do so with everything compiled into one place. Thank you, Jonas.
Thank you.
May your week be flowing and full of good rules.
Thank you. And righteousness and justice.
And righteousness and justice. Thank you.
Bye bye.